Okay, today is March 12th, 2021. I am Dale Erickson, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Benjamin Alpers over Zoom about Oklahoma Humanities and his interactions with the organization as a part of Oklahoma Humanities' 50th anniversary project. So thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So to start off, why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I'm Ben Alpers. I've been teaching at the University of Oklahoma since 1998. I was one of the 3 founding faculty members of the Honors College. I grew up in California, went to college and graduate school in the Northeast. Happy to talk more about that if that's of interest to you. Spent a year in Missouri and then came here. And I'd actually never set foot in Oklahoma before my interview, which to put all of this in terms of how long ago that was. The day of my interview was literally the day the Monica Lewinsky story broke. So I'm waking up in my room, turn on the TV, all hell's breaking loose on TV. I'm like, I can't pay attention to that. I need to pay attention to this interview. But anyway, so I arrived in the fall of 1998, and my involvement with Oklahoma Humanities began in, I think, 2006 is the first time I got on the board. And I believe Joanna Rapp, who was who's now retired, but was a faculty member in English and Film and Media Studies at OU, and had been a board member at Oklahoma Humanities, sort of put my name in the hamper, and I got contacted, and it seemed interesting to me because I'm really interested in public humanities and scholars communicating to a broader public. I blogged at the US Intellectual History blog for a long time and edited it. So sort of in my wheelhouse. And I also, since arriving in Oklahoma, I've really tried to kind of get involved in my community and my state. And this seemed like a good opportunity to do that. So I came on the board. My first meeting was Anita Mae's last meeting as executive director. So I came on after Ann Thompson had been given the job, but one meeting before she started, just to give you some sort of sense of when that was. And I served 2 terms then, rolled off after 2 terms. So that was probably 2012. And then went back on the board, filling an unfilled term, the last 2 years an unfilled term in 2016. And I've been on the board ever since. We'll go into more details about things I've done on the board at various times, but that's a nice kind of outline of my board service.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, so just tell me a little bit about your experience growing up and your education up through high school.
Okay. I grew up, as I said, I grew up mainly in Berkeley, California. Both my parents I was born in 1965. So I got caught the very tail end of Berkeley in the 60s as a little kid, and then mainly grew up in Berkeley in the 70s, which if you talk to anybody who grew up in Berkeley in the 70s, it felt a bit like we'd all missed some kind of party. It all seemed very boring. And there was all this exciting stuff that had happened in the very recent past that we were just a little too young to have experienced. I spent, again, most of my childhood in Berkeley. Both my parents were professors at the University of California. My dad was an English professor, specializing in Renaissance lyric poetry. My mom is an art historian. She's since retired, mainly doing 17th century Dutch art history. So I sort of grew up in a humanities household. Spent most of my time in the Berkeley public schools. Actually, I'm exactly the same generation as Kamala Harris. So I had the same experience she did, which was experiencing Berkeley's very successful busing program. And, the schools I went to, 4th and 6th grade, were very successfully integrated. And, probably a conversation for another day, but that moment of the first debate, I guess it was the first or second presidential debate, seems so long ago now, a year and a half ago, when Kamala Harris talked about her experience with that, really rang bells, because she's exactly the same generation as I am, and we experienced the same Berkeley public schools. And I spent some years, both my parents being professors, I spent some years on sabbatical elsewhere, a year in Palo Alto, half a year in the Netherlands, a couple years at various times in the UK, a year in Princeton, New Jersey, at various times in my childhood. I ended up actually, though I mainly went to Berkeley Public Schools, I ended up spending my last 2 years of high school, actually beginning my freshman year, we then went away for a year and a half on a sabbatical thing, and then came back on my last 2 years in a private school in Oakland, California, called the College Preparatory School, which was a great education and in most ways a pretty unpleasant time for me. It was not, it was very small, very intense, very, full of itself in a lot of ways. And again, I learned a ton. I really learned how to write in a way that I think most kids in high school don't. But, and I did a lot of debate in high school, and that was kind of, you know, my outlet for all kinds of things. When I was applying for college, I knew I kind of wanted to get away. Not that I didn't like Berkeley, I loved Berkeley, but I just kind of felt like, you know, going to college in your hometown, which was of course a possibility because the University of California is right there, seemed like a you know, not something I wanted to do. And I wasn't particularly interested in other schools in California. And the other part of the country that I was most familiar with was actually the Northeast, because both my parents grew up there. My mom grew up in Boston area, and my dad grew up outside Philly. And by the time I was in high school, my grandparents, my mom's parents, had moved to New York. So I kind of knew the Northeast. So if I was going to not go to college in California, the place that seemed most natural to go was the Northeast. And I applied a variety of places, and I ended up going to Harvard this would be the early 80s, because I graduated from high school in 82. And I was class of 86 there. And when I got there, Harvard at the time made you declare your major your second semester freshman year, which is nuts, right? Because like, who knows what they're doing then. But I was not 100% sure what I wanted to do. I was kind of interested in history, but for a variety of reasons didn't want to major in history. And there was this interdisciplinary major there called social studies, which is very broad. You can do a whole bunch of different things with. And that seemed like a really good deal for me, because I kind of knew I wanted to do something like that. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it's like, again, very broad and interdisciplinary. So I ended up majoring in social studies, which the kind of foundation of that is a sophomore course that you take all your sophomore year, which is basically kind of an introduction to modern social theory. So you read Adam Smith, Mill, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Freud. Yeah, that's the canon. Oh, and Tocqueville. So I think that got me interested in a broad sense, actually, in intellectual history. You can do a lot of things with those guys, but that's what I took away from it. And I also was interested at the time in Russian things. So I was starting sophomore year, taking Russian language, spent the summer between junior and senior year actually in a Russian language program in what was then Leningrad in the Soviet Union, which was really kind of interesting. And I ended up writing a senior thesis on 18th century Russian nationalism. Though by the time I was done with that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I was pretty sure I didn't want to go into Russian stuff. I mean, both because, you know, my Russian language wasn't bad, but I never felt sort of like 100% comfortable with it. And the kinds of questions I'm interested in, which are intellectual history questions, if you don't really get the language, it's not, I felt like, what business do I have doing this? And it was also a very weird time for Russian studies in the 80s. On the one hand, there was money all over the place, but it was very oriented towards the Cold War. So if you weren't interested in Cold War type stuff, you were sort of swimming upstream all the time, because that's kind of what like Russian studies was all about. And then also, you know, access to things was very limited during the Cold War, right? When the Soviet Union collapses, the archives open up and the money disappears. And there's this whole generation of like really fascinating young Russian historians, many of whom didn't get jobs, who had access to stuff that nobody ever had access to before. And then that started shutting down by the end of the 90s. And so there's this like period where you could like see anything in the Soviet archives. And, you know, I never regretted that I didn't sort of experience that, only not to get a job. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And one of the things Harvard has, in addition to, you know, the big Rhodes and Marshall and all that, they have these kind of in-house scholarships to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And so I actually did apply for the Rhodes. I mean, that's the other weird thing about Harvard. They don't vet, or at least they didn't vet Rhodes and Marshall applications. They just let anybody apply who wanted to. It was like, just like throwing stuff at the wall. And I actually think I didn't have any business applying for either of them, particularly coming from California, where it's like nearly impossible to get them. But I did, because their attitude was just, oh, apply, and didn't get anywhere. And then since I was sort of thinking about that anyway, I applied to these in-house scholarships, but they required, unlike the Rhodes and Marshall, they required that you apply to an Oxford or Cambridge college and get in. So I also didn't get that, but I had applied to Merton College, Oxford to study history. And by the time I was, you know, getting to the end of my second semester senior year, I had gotten into Merton College. I didn't have a scholarship. My thought was, I'll just go home and hang out in Berkeley. And for a variety of reasons, my parents really didn't want me to do that. It wasn't a good moment in their marriage, actually. They were that was falling apart. And they did not want me, you know, spending a year in Berkeley. So they're like, don't worry, we'll pay you to go to Oxford for a year. I'm like, great, okay, I'll do that. So I was on an Alpers scholarship at Oxford, as I used to tell people, in Merton College, studying modern history, which just means not ancient history. That was interesting. I mean, I think I don't know if they do this as aggressively as they did in the 80s, but in the 80s, they used to always tell Americans, do a second BA, which is like a 2-year degree. An Oxford BA is a 3-year degree. And there are ways in which certain BA programs that make sense with. In certain ways, it didn't really make sense with history. And the reason is that at least back in the day, when you did a BA in history at Oxford, it was entirely oriented toward historiography, which is actually kind of a nice foundation in some ways, but you did none of your own research, right? I'd like just come off doing a big research project as a senior thesis. And here I was, basically what you do in an Oxford history degree is read a bunch of history and summarize it. So it's historiography. So, and I mean, actually I learned a lot, but it was also, I kind of felt by the end of I was going to be there for 2 years, but by the end of 1 year there, I kind of felt like this is not exactly what I want to be spending my time doing at this moment in my life. That summer, actually, I was working at it's a summer camp that pretends to be a summer school program called Exploration in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and which was itself an interesting experience. But while I was there, so this is the summer of '87, and back in the Boston area, and the presidential campaign is starting up. And some people I know are, you know, thinking of working on the Dukakis campaign. And so I thought, well, that seems like a more interesting thing to do right now. So I made this call, the end of that summer. Okay, I'm just gonna, I came back to the US fully expecting to go back to Oxford, finish my Oxford second BA in history in the fall, but I just sort of, that summer I just made the call, no, I'm gonna hang out, live with friends in Somerville, Massachusetts, and work at the Dukakis headquarters, volunteer with some expectation of getting a staff position, which I actually eventually got. And I had to fly back to Oxford, pull all my stuff out of storage, fly back, apologize to all my tutors and so on. But one of the things that happened to me while I was in Oxford is I got really interested in American stuff, which I had never been in college. I was really focusing on European history, Russian stuff, and so on. And there was something about Oxford's, literally the first two people I met when I arrived at Oxford in the fall of '86 were two classmates of mine from Harvard who I never met when I was at Harvard, which tells you something about the world's elite, right? You sort of you're checking into this Oxford dorm room, and then these two guys who are just from other parts of the Harvard experience. And I got, it was a very interesting time to be American in England because English people who I felt very unsympathetic to loved Americans. This was like Margaret Thatcher time. And so there were all of these kind of, the expression that the English used to use at the time was young fogies. That is like young people who kind of were like old people, who were very into like business and Thatcher and making money. And all those things were very much associated with America. And there was sort of a sense that, look, I actually had a guy I knew say to me, what I love about you Americans is you're not embarrassed about having a lot of money. I'm like, I would know I don't have a lot of money. But there was all that. And then there were English people who I felt much more sympathetic with, who, for the very same reason, tended to like assume you were terrible if you were American, right? So it was like this really interesting experience. And it got me, I was very interested in England by the time I got done spending a year there, but I also was very interested in America, like how the hell, and there are other things too, which you really, at least in those years, felt as an American in Oxford, which is like all of the faculty you'd run into would go on and on about the special relationship between England and the US, which is, I don't think, a term I ever heard before I was at Oxford, right? So they have this whole sort of view of the world where like there's this special closeness between our countries. And I'm like, really? I don't know about that. Interesting that you think that way. And I'd spent some time in England. I'd spent a year when I was 1, but I also spent second grade in England, which was an interesting but very alienating experience for me, because England now and a little more in the 80s was a multicultural place. England in 1972 was, well, it may have been multicultural, but it hadn't figured that out yet. And so as a little kid who wasn't English, you felt very much as an outsider. My teachers treated me as an outsider. My fellow classmates treated me as an outsider. I was less an outsider than the 2 Spanish kids in my class, but cold comfort. So anyway, the idea of this like special relationship seems sort of weird to me. But so after like clearing out of Oxford, I came back, joined the Dukakis campaign. I eventually became the assistant to the surrogate scheduler, my favorite job title of all time. So I was in the scheduling office, and I was, the scheduling office had one person whose job it was to oversee campaign surrogates other than Kitty Dukakis, the governor's wife. She had her own office. So we would be, we were responsible for scheduling other family members, celebrities, Bobby Orr, the hockey player, Al Franken, who was then just a comedian, and so on. And I mainly was like, assembling briefing books for them and driving them to the airport and stuff like that. And it was an interesting year, and I would not trade it for anything. I wouldn't have traded for anything at the time. And it gave me an understanding of politics that I otherwise wouldn't have. But from very early on in working on the campaign, it was totally clear to me that I was not wired the right way to I'm not sure I ever thought that I was going to do this professionally, but within 2 weeks in that office, I'm like, great place to visit, wouldn't want to live there kind of thing, right? And in scheduling in particular, I don't know if this is boring and off topic, but in scheduling in particular, what you want to do, if the way to get ahead in scheduling is you get into advance. Right, those are the sort of the comers in scheduling, and you sort of move up the ranks, and then you can get a permanent career doing this. And being an advanced person for a campaign is just misery. You're never anywhere for like more than 2 days. You come in, you run an event, and if you're good at it, you run an event and you convince the local people that they're running the event, but you don't let them run the event because they're going to screw it up. But if they know you're running the event, they're pissed off at you. So it's all about like going in and actually running things and having nobody know you're actually running things. This is not my skill set, needless to say. So I did not try to do that. I was happy to like stay on desk in Boston for most of my time there. But anyway, I knew early on that this is not what I wanted to do with my life. So what then? Law school or graduate school in history. And so I took the LSAT, took the GREs. Applied. Did I apply to law school? I'm not sure I even applied to law school that fall, but I applied to graduate school and applied for scholarships and so on. And so I ended up leaving the campaign right after the convention, going off to graduate school at Princeton in history. I always say when I left the campaign, we were 18 points up in the polls. It was all downhill from there, basically. That was an old-fashioned convention balance. We really weren't 18 points up. We were 18 points up in the polls, but it didn't mean anything. So I then just started a PhD program in American history. I thought that I was probably going to be doing 19th century stuff. I'd done 18th century Russian stuff in college. And over the course of my first year at Princeton, I just kind of found myself, my interest slipping more and more forward in time. And by the time I was into my second year, you do your general exams at the end of your second year, I knew that I wanted to work on the 20th century. And so I ended up, writing a dissertation about American responses to the European dictatorships in the 30s and 40s and the development of the idea of totalitarianism. So that's kind of, that became my first book. Dictators, Democracy, and American Public Culture, University of North Carolina Press, if you're really interested. So I finished up in '94 there, my PhD, and I got, the job market was much better than it is now, but it still wasn't great. But I got a gig, these very nice 3-year gigs as lecturers at Princeton. So I went on the faculty, totally non-tenure track, but they were very weird jobs. It was kind of, it's the academic proletarian aristocracy, I always describe it. So you are treated like a Princeton faculty member. You have access to the insane benefits packages that I still have, retirement money that I accumulated 3 years at Princeton, right? I mean, it's just kind of nuts. But it's totally terminal, right? So, and the year after that, I got married to my wife, Karen, who was in graduate school with me she was in German. And she went off, she got a job at the University of Missouri after 1 year later. So we were commuting for my last 2 years of my lectureship between Princeton, New Jersey, and Columbia, Missouri. And by the time I got through my lectureship, I didn't get a job anywhere. So I went to Missouri, basically, gainfully unemployed, living as a trailing spouse in Columbia and doing just sort of a little adjunct teaching on the side at the University of Missouri. And that was the year that I got this job. And OU was, I told myself this is my last year on the job market. It was my 5th year on the job market. And I got 3 jobs that year. I got 2, I would have gotten a 3rd. I think partly because I just had stopped caring. And you're a better interview if you're just like, whatever, you want to give me something great. And what made OU far and away the job I wanted to take was that at the time, OU was being very aggressive about spousal hiring. So they were able to create a tenure track line for Karen. And so it not only got me a job, it solved the great problem of dual career academic couples, which is how do you end up at the same place? And we've been here ever since. And that's how I ended up in Oklahoma. And it was a interesting job and a good place to be from the moment I arrived, actually. I got lucky. A lot of first jobs are miserable, and this was an interesting first job. It was a weird first job because the Honors College was new. And usually, if you're in a history department and you're a first-year faculty member, you get usually given a bunch of service courses, and you don't have any choice what you're teaching. I came into the job, and they're like, well, what do you want to teach? I'm like, well, what are the limits it's like, it's interdisciplinary. You can teach whatever you want. And I'm like, wow, great. And it took me 2 or 3 years to figure out. And I was teaching new stuff every semester, and which is really difficult. And it took me 2 or 3 years to realize, wait a minute, I don't have to do that. I can teach the same course more than once, of course, right? Like a normal person. And then it became a better job once I realized I didn't. It was crazy saying, hey, what do I want to teach this semester? Which is what I did for my first couple of years here. Yeah, that's I exceeded. You asked me about my years through high school, and I got you to Oklahoma. So I'll shut up. Ask another question.
I mean, I would have asked you for all that other information anyway, so it's fine by me. But so after getting to Oklahoma, when did you first become aware of Oklahoma Humanities?
I'm not sure. I mean, I was always aware of state humanities councils as the sort of, as the NEH representative on the ground. I didn't have any involvement. That is, I don't have any particular memory of going to an event and registering that as, oh, this is an Oklahoma Humanities Council event. But I was, I said, totally aware of its existence. So when it's probably in 2006, when I got the email. I can't remember if it was first from Anita or first from Joanna, saying, hey, would you be interested in serving on the board? I knew what it was about and jumped at the opportunity. But again, I hadn't had any experience with the organization at that point, any really meaningful experience. So I had some idea of what it was about, but in terms of the way it operated and so on, my experience with it really began by joining the board back in 2006.
What was the process like for getting onto the board?
You'd have to ask people. I mean, now I know because I'm chair of the board development committee. But honestly, I had no idea. I got an email saying, "Hey, do you want to serve on the board?" I'm like, "Sounds great. What do I need to do?" And I think I had to write like a little sort of biographical paragraph, maybe something about like why I wanted to serve on the board and send a CV to somebody. And so I did that. And then shortly thereafter, I was, "You're on the board." I'm like, "Great." So you need to ask Joanna or Anita or somebody about what the process was like back then. I can tell you what the process is like now, which I assume, given the way things work at Oklahoma Humanities, is probably an evolutionary outgrowth of what the process was like then, which is that that people nominate people to be on the board. Now we have more self-nominations than we did back then, I think. And then the board development committee, I'm not sure it had that name back then, usually would reach out to people who were nominated that way. And then there'd be, depending on how many slots they're available, you vet the people. We tend to, under my leadership, the board development committee tends to interview potential board candidates, just kind of, not only so that we get to know them, but so they get to know us and know what they're getting into. Then there's a slate of nominees presented to the membership meeting. This is one of the peculiar things about the structure of Oklahoma Humanities is our fall meeting every year, board meeting, is both a board meeting and a membership meeting. And the membership of Oklahoma Humanities is identical to the board of Oklahoma Humanities. But the membership elects the board. So you adjourn, you temporarily have the board meeting begins, then at a certain point you adjourn the board meeting, you call the membership meeting to order. Whoever's in charge of the board development committee presents the slate of candidates. You vote on the slate of candidates. You then adjourn the membership committee for a year, and you go back to the board committee, which then elects the executive, because it's the board that then elects the executive board. It's sort of bureaucratically hilarious. But anyway, I didn't experience any of that because that happens before you get on the board.
Okay.
So after that, I guess it was probably a board orientation. I'm guessing that, I'm not actually sure when Anne came on, but certainly the board orientation, Anita was still the director. And I knew her because we'd served together on, since I'm not in the history department, the history department can use me as an outside committee member here at OU. And so we were both, when OU does endowed searches for like senior positions, I think they're required to have 2 people from outside the department and 1 person from outside OU. So Anita and I had been actually on a history department search committee together because she had a PhD in French history from OU. So she was like a perfect sort of community person to bring in for a search like this. And then I was like a, convenient person because I'm a historian and I'm not in the history department. And so I got to know her a little through that beforehand. But that was probably like a year or 2 before 2006. But then, it was like, "Hi, welcome to the board. I'm not going to be here anymore. We have a new person coming in." So basically, my board service began with Anne arriving as the new chair, the executive director of it.
All right. So when you first got on the board, sort of what was expected of you as a board member?
Good question. One of the things that I've always appreciated about Oklahoma Humanities, and really from the start, is that we've had an excellent staff, excellent executive directors, and both of whom had a very clear sense of what the board's job was. And I've served over the years on a lot of nonprofit boards, some actually before I was on the board of Oklahoma Humanities, or was then Oklahoma Humanities Council. And my experience in a lot of those boards was that you'd show up at a board meeting and the board would to a certain extent have to figure out what it is it was supposed to do, because a lot of them, these organizations were understaffed or had huge overturning of executive directors. So things were always in flux and the board was just kind of like the source of stability. And one of the things that like I loved about serving on Oklahoma Humanities from the beginning is it was totally clear what your job was. And you had some choice because there were these committees, but all the committees had clear functions. So if you got on a committee, what the committee was up to was clear. It had a task and it would do that task. There was work to be done and it was doable. And from the moment I got on this board, it's been a sort of model to my mind of the way to run a nonprofit board. And there have been times when I've been foolish enough to think that I could improve other nonprofit boards by trying to take some of the lessons I learned from this board. And again, what I think I've learned over the years is that the real magic sauce here is a great staff, and a staff that's large enough, right? So that what the board isn't doing the staff's work because you have enough staff that the staff can do the staff's work. So, right from the start, I really appreciated that they made clear what the work of the board was, clear what your responsibilities were on the board, and then when you got to committees, on committees. And back then, the whole board really reviewed grant applications. So, I have my early memories are, this is back in the day when this was not done online. And they weren't even distributing them in 2006, 2007 in PDFs. You would get a packet of, it seems like another universe. They would photocopy and staple and then send you a packet of these like ginormous grant applications, and you'd sit and look through them all and show up and vote on them. And that actually, I'm glad I eventually ended up, I'm not sure it was the first committee I was on, but it was one of the first committees I was on was the Grant Review Committee, which is now where that work is done by and large. I mean, now the way things work and is the Grant Review Committee does the really heavy lifting on the grants and then comes with good reports to the body of the board, and the board votes on them. But I'm actually very glad we did them that way when I came on the board, because you get a sense of the scope of the work of the council when you look at all those grants and really look at them closely, both in terms of the sorts of things that we're funding and also what we're asking of grantees, right? Which is if I had never done that and never served on the Grant Review Committee, I mean, I have a hard time kind of imagining what this must be like, but I think it's probably the experience of at least half our board that doesn't do grant review they can look at these applications if they want to, but mostly they're getting a sort of digested summary of them from the Grant Review Committee. And I really appreciated kind of getting my hands dirty back in the day, looking at the raw material of the applications, because it just gave me a really good sense of the process. Which is, obviously it's not the only thing we do, but it's always been re-granting has always been a big part of what Oklahoma Humanities does and a big part of what the board does. And so kind of being put to work early on that and also really kind of getting a sense of how that worked made me feel like I was in the flow of things early on. And the other thing is when I came on the board, I was one of 2 OU board members. So David Levy, who was a colleague of mine in history, was the other person on the board from OU at the time. And that was helpful too, because it meant there was somebody I knew around. I guess Joanna, I think, had been on the board at some point, but she wasn't on the board when I came on. But having David there was helpful too, because it meant that it's somebody I knew who I could ask questions of if I had any and so on.
Yeah. What sort of things would the board look for in grant applications?
Well, I mean, back then, I mean, they're like minimal things you have to look for, which is it humanities? Does the budget make sense? If you have a match, is it a proper match? Um, if you have more applications than you have money, you're looking at, as well at just like which is a more compelling program. But you're trying to look. Back then, you were just kind of looking at the quality of the programming. And over the years, I think what we've done more of uh, is really kind of assessment of how well programs went. So if someone's coming to us with a similar grant from what they've had in the past, we these days have a much more robust sense of how things went before. I mean, we'd have some sense then, but really the sort of rubrics that the council uses now to evaluate programming are more robust and more specific. And that allows these days, and when I say these days, I'm talking at least the last 5, if not 10 years, the council to say no, or say, look, the last time you did this wasn't good enough. You've got to make this better. And so there's more of that now than there used to be back in the day. And then look at the sort of impact too, as well, which is something also I think we've become more specific about over the years, because it is a public humanities program. I mean, we have scholar grants, but they're small. The big grants are the public programming grants. And so you want to look to see, I mean, when you had competitive grant rounds, that is when there was more requests than we had funds, public impact, and also just kind of making sure that we spread the wealth as much as possible around the state. I mean, there's a very strong sense that the more impact we have in more places, the better. The better we're doing our job, and the better it is for the state. And in the long run, also the better it is for our funding, because if you do humanities on the Hill and you go to our congressional delegation, you want to be able to each congressperson say, look, here in the last year are the events we funded in your district. And that's the way then they get it, and they're like, okay, maybe I will vote for the NEH this time.
Yeah. Beyond just the grant things, what are some other things that you've done as part of the board?
Well, in my first 2 terms, I was for a long time on the programming committee, which is a committee whose tasks have sort of evolved over the years as needed, which I think is the flexibility of that committee speaks in a sense to the strength of the organization too. So when I was on it, the most interesting moment I was on it was a time, I guess it was probably like right after or right before a round of strategic planning, when we were really kind of reconsidering our programming. And one of the things we were involved in is really creating Oklahoma Humanities Magazine as it stands today, which was a sort of, its predecessor was something that was a lot closer to a newsletter. And I mean, Carla deserves 99.9% of praise for that. I mean, it's her vision and her work that made the magazine what it was. But the program committee was the kind of place where the board could provide support for that effort and encouragement for that effort. And I'm very proud of the 0.1% of that, which was us. And that was when I was on the program committee that we were really creating that transition to Oklahoma Humanities Magazine, which I think is like now one of the most successful programs of the council. Trying to think like what else I did. I was vice chair during 1 year in that first time on the board, and that was that just before? I'm trying to think when that was. I can't remember what year that was. And at one point sort of inquired whether I was interested in being chair, but I actually was on sabbatical and there was a project that I had to write. And I'm like, I don't want to be chair when I'm on sabbatical. And it didn't help me finish the project, but I guess it couldn't have helped. And then I rolled off in 2012, just you can serve 2 consecutive terms. And then for the next 4 years, I wasn't very involved much. There have been various moments when executive directors have been more interested in kind of bringing old board members back to do things. And there was one board meeting where there were a bunch of us that were brought back, probably like 2013, 2014 somewhere. But then 2016, gosh, I'm now blanking on who was head of the board development committee then, gave me a call and sort of said, would you be interested in rolling back on the board? I'm like, yes, because I'd actually missed it a lot. Because as I already said, I mean, I believe really passionately in the work of Oklahoma Humanities, but I also just love this board. I mean, and there's nothing like working in a way where you feel like you see results and get stuff done, right? And that's always been, part of the feedback loop of serving on this board is not only is the work good and important, but it's effective. And I missed that in my years off the board. So I kind of leapt at the chance to get back on the board. And since then, I've done grant review, I've done board development. I'm trying to think if I've been on any other committees since. I don't think I have since 2016. I think I joined grant review, and then a few years ago, Anne said, hey, do you want to head up board development? I'm like, okay, I've never been on board development. Tell me what we do. And I've been doing that ever since, and that's been interesting. Oh, and then the other thing I've done actually in this stint is I was on the search committee for Anne's successor, which was an interesting process, and a bit like and a bit unlike an academic search. Scott Lamaskis was the chair of it, and since he is an academic, I think it was maybe more like an academic search than it might have been, which both was very comfy for me because I know academic searches backwards and forwards, but also, I mean, I'm not sure the right way to do any of these things. It's not quite an academic search though, right? And so it all worked out in the end. I mean, I think it was a very successful search, and Caroline has been terrific since we hired her. But it's an interesting process, right? I mean, this is an organization that has not had a lot of executive directors, right? Anita was executive director for decades and decades and decades. Anne was executive director for almost a decade and a half. And so, I mean, that's a good thing, but it also means that there's not a lot of institutional memory of executive director searches, right? I mean, I was as close on that committee. I was as close, I think, to someone who experienced the last executive director search, and I didn't. I just missed it, right? So, like, I heard a lot of stories about it, but I wasn't around for it. I mean, I don't know what is appropriate even to go into in terms of executive director searches. But that was the other sort of big thing I've been involved in. And as chair of the board development committee, I'm also on the executive committee, which I've been on before as vice chair during my first stint. And so that's the other service I've done on the board. I do want to say, I've been meaning to say, and I might as well just say it, that the other thing that I love about serving on the board is it gets me out of the bubble of OU. And in two very different ways. One is, and this is the fault of academics, we tend not to, we know people in our fields around the country, but you just don't get to know people at other institutions in the state of Oklahoma. So it's been really nice to connect to people at OSU, UCO, OKCU, Northeastern, all the various schools that I've met faculty members there through this organization who otherwise I would never have gotten to know. And then even more people beyond the academy from around the state. And that just, I mean, first of all, the board tends to attract interesting and nice people, but they're also interesting and nice people from places and walks of life that I just don't otherwise get to meet. And that's just been personally gratifying, just socially pleasurable, and also incredibly useful in getting me to understand the state better in a way that I never would have. I mean, I love Norman. I don't think there's anywhere else I'd rather live in the state of Oklahoma, but getting to know people from Enid, getting to know people from Altus, getting to go to these places, which is something we used to have board meetings, at least one board meeting a year somewhere else. And I think before the pandemic hit, Caroline had been talking about returning to that. And I think we will return to that, because one of our challenges at the Board Development Committee now is way too many of us are from Central Oklahoma. And I think one of the reasons that's been the case is for almost a decade now, all of our board meetings have been in Oklahoma City, and I think that's been a mistake. But anyway, getting to know the state better has been one of the things that has been really good about serving on this board for me.
Yeah, that leads well to what I wanted to ask anyway. Sort of like who comprises the board in like a general sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting mix of people, right? So there's always a good chunk of academics, and there should be, because scholars are involved in our programming. I mean, the definition of scholar and that the NEH has, and this is important, isn't just academics, right? So academics are a subset of scholars, but they're an important subset of scholars. And so making sure there are a bunch of us around is important. But then beyond it, it's this like really interesting mix of people who are just interested in public humanities, readers of various sorts in various walks of life. And, you know, in terms of board needs, it's always important that we have some lawyers. It's always important that we have some people from the world of finance who really understand money. So that means there's usually a banker or two, and usually a lawyer or two. And then in addition to that, just wide mix of people, retired school teachers, people with you know, master's degrees in things who just went off and did other things with their life, and now this is a way for them to sort of, you know, get back to humanities things that they specialized in earlier in their lives. A real mix of people. It skews a bit old, right? I think like when the young people on the board are usually young academics, right? And so I think it's challenging to get, we've had some young professionals on, but I think it's a little challenging to get young professionals on the board sometime. Outside of, again, the academic or quasi-academic world. So like museum, I'm trying to think of young non-academics we have on the board now. There's some people from the museum world. And then there are the gubernatorial appointees, who are even, in a sense, even more of a grab bag, because different governors appoint different sorts of people. And those are a different set of networks, if I can put it that way, to get people to the board. So it's a really interesting mix of people.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, so we're about 10 minutes out from an hour. So at this point, I'd just like to give the floor to you to talk about anything about Oklahoma Humanities that you haven't yet, or even just anything about the humanities in general.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we are. I think we're a very successful organization. We're not a huge, you know, the world of humanities councils, which is another thing that this has like made me aware of that I wasn't aware of before, which is the Federation of State Humanities Councils, which is the umbrella organization for the humanities councils. And if you go to their events, their conference, which I've been to once, or Humanities on the Hill, their lobbying day in DC, you get a sense of the different humanities councils around the country. And we fit in an interesting place there. There's some of them that are huge and just have lots of money and lots more programming, right? So like Virginia, New York, it's just a different scale from us. And there's some that are really tiny and just scraping by, and that's not us either. We are a sort of smallish to medium size, but very vigorous council with, I'd say, nationally prominent leadership, right? So like Anne was very important in federation things. We've had people who are board members serve on the Federation Council. So Oklahoma Humanities has a real national presence, which is nice. It's kind of gratifying when you go with like your peers, board members and staff members from around the country. And they know about us. We do a good job. That being said, we can always do better. And you know, it's a question of kind of looking, and this is something that I also really appreciate about this organization. It does strategic planning seriously, because I would say 3/4 of strategic planning in this world is just make work bullshit. I mean, to be perfectly honest. So you're spending many hours of your life producing documents that no one will ever look at again after they're written. And you're pretending to plan and you're not. And that has never been the case. I've done 3 rounds of strategic planning, I think, in my time on the board. And there's another one coming up. Is it next year? Yeah, I think it is next year. And they've always been serious, and they've always been really trying to look at what works and what doesn't work and what could we be doing more of. And, you know, serving younger populations, serving populations in rural Oklahoma. Museum on Main Street does a really good job of reaching out to small town Oklahoma, but there are other things that, you know, we could, and let's talk about it too, to a certain extent, because there are libraries around the state. We can always do better with that. We can do better reaching younger people. And at various times we've had programs that have reached out to schools. I don't think they've ever been as effective as we'd like them to be. And I think that's something that's always on the back burner. Is there some other way to get back into the school space? Prisons, let's talk about it goes into prisons, but we haven't done as much stuff in with incarcerated folks in the state as some other humanities councils do. That's an area that would be interesting looking into. We had a pilot program back about a decade ago doing medical humanities stuff in hospitals, which was fascinating and I think a really good program, but it somehow just didn't take. So like after trying it out for a while, I wasn't directly involved in it, but the people who were directly involved in it felt that it just wasn't working. But that again, if you could make that work, I mean, particularly after this year, right, and looking at frontline workers, and the whole idea of that program is kind of enriching people's lives, which in a way that like lowers stress and also enriches their practice of medicine, right? We had a guy on the board then who was a professor at OU Med School, so he sort of came out of a world that was thinking about these sorts of things. So that's a space that would be interesting to go back. There are always things like that, right? Our podcast is still relatively new and is still evolving. And I think that's something, that's a really interesting place where you can reach a lot of people you haven't reached before. But podcasting is very crowded now. So, I mean, I think I'm very committed to it, and I'm actually kind of involved in like thinking about what the next stage of it is now. But when we talk about that in strategic planning, I think one of the things we need to talk about is how to get it to punch a little more above its weight than it is now, because we produce good content, but I'm not sure we have the listener base we ought to have. So there are all kinds of things like that. There are always opportunities to reach new people, and also from the other end to kind of get more interesting humanities content coming into the state, right? So I have a friend who's chair of Oklahoma Scholarship, OSLAP, whatever that stands for, right? Which is this statewide program which brings in people from around the country to teach these sort of intensive seminars to students from throughout the state. And we've had individual grants come from OSLAP to Oklahoma Humanities. So, for example, Helen Prejean, the nun who's involved in death penalty issues, right? Dead Man Walking, that whole thing. She was brought in by OSU to do an OSLAP there, and we paid for a public event, right? But what I'm sort of trying to get Carl, who's the chair over there now, and Caroline to sort of sit down and see if we can have a more permanent partnership, because I think that's a great, because OSLAP's problem is they are a budget line item of the regents, of the state regents. And it's not going anywhere, but it's a tiny percentage of the region's budget, and the percentage stays the same. So as the region's budget shrinks and public education budgets, that's the direction they go these days. As it shrinks, the OSLEP budget shrinks, and people's speaker fees and honorariums go up. And so they're able to afford fewer national people than they used to be able to afford. So my thought was we could get together and bring in one real heavy hitter every year who would teach an OSLEP and then do a neat public event on some campus. And that's the other great thing, that OSLEP events can happen around the state. So it's a chance to bring someone in, to, I don't know, Ada of a sort that never shows up in Ada, right? And there are all kinds of opportunities like that. It's always, and again, the fact that it's an organization that's interested in thinking about new things is one of the other exciting things about it. So I'm always looking ahead to new things. The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is coming up in 2026. The NEH is way into that, and we will be playing some role in all of that. And I think we're just on the cusp of beginning to think about that. That's still 5 years out, but 5 years goes by real quickly. So I think there are a lot of exciting things coming up.
Yeah, that's all great. Well, if you don't have anything else to share.
I don't know that I do. I mean, I don't know if there's anything like particular you want to ask about what I now think of as the old days, which aren't that old. I mean, the really interesting old days is when this organization was really beginning, and that's a whole different thing. Because again, by the time I came on board, it was a fairly well-oiled machine, and are you interviewing Ann Thompson? I hope you get a chance to talk to her.
We're doing that at some point. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't know if I'll be involved with that, but yeah.
Because I think she's the only director who came from out of state to be director to be the executive director. And that worked wonderfully. And I think one of the reasons that worked wonderfully is we had this very good, stable staff who could introduce her to Oklahoma, and that all worked. And those were my early days on the board. And so, I mean, I don't think I was in a position to really understand it, but it felt like an extremely smooth transition. I mean, because, brand new executive director coming in, and you never know it. I mean, as a new board member.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining me today and doing this.
You're very welcome. I will send you those 2 documents, and if you need anything else from me, just holler.
Yeah, for sure.